Hello and welcome to today's TOC podcast. I'm Joe Weichert, co-chair of O'Reilly's Tools of Change conference. I'd like to remind you that you can keep up on all the upcoming TOC events, including webcasts and podcasts, by visiting the conference website, toccon.com. TOC Frankfurt is the next in-person event on the schedule, and it's less than a month away. This year features not only the full-day TOC event on Tuesday, October 11th, but also a half-day social media workshop on Thursday the 13th. For more information or to register, visit tocfrankfurt.com. For today's podcast, I'm joined by Kristen McLean, founder and CEO of Bookigee. If you're not familiar with it, Bookigee is a new kind of platform for exploring books, authors, and other kinds of related media. I should also mention that the platform is still in the development stage. The first product, an audience analytics tool, is due this fall. So stay tuned for more information soon. Kristen, welcome to this TOC podcast.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here.
So, Kristen, when we spoke before, you told me about how you're a big fan of the Agile development model. Let's start there. When you use the term Agile, what specifically are you referring to?
I'm really talking more broadly. I think people who are familiar with software will know Agile as a very dominant software development methodology for quick iterations and developing products that you push out and then you receive audience feedback and then you develop some more. It's very iterative. I'm really interested, when I talk about Agile in the context of publishing, I'm really interested in thinking about Agile methodologies and the ways that we can apply them to both the publishing model in terms of workflow, but also in terms of content development. And I think those are very different things, but I think there are some really interesting opportunities as we're in the middle of a big transformation of our model to think about ways to apply Agile to the publishing process.
Okay, so yeah, and I think a lot of people may be familiar with how it's used in software development, but can you give us some specifics of how you've applied it in publishing?
Well, I think we are adopting Agile within our own company because obviously although we're coming out of publishing, we are working on a software platform. But I think what that has made me think about is, having come from mainstream publishing, before I started this company, I spent 17 years in the publishing industry in roles ranging from frontline bookseller all the way through major marketing. And for those of you guys who don't know me, I spent the last 5 years running one of the major trade associations that represents booksellers to the publishing industry. And in that role, I was really an industry analyst, really thinking about the model and thinking about changes and paradigm shifts. So when I started developing this new platform and started immersing myself in the world of software development and really thinking about the way that we were going to be working through our own project, I really had an eye-opening experience when I started to think about Agile technologies in software and then like what they could do for the publishing process. And I'll tell you a little more about that. Basically, in software development, there are two real models. There's what's called waterfall development and agile development. Waterfall development is really the kind of analog to the way that we have typically created content in the publishing industry. It basically presumes that you start out, you identify a project that you want to work on, you outline all of the specifications of that project, and then you document those, and then you build it, and then you package it, you test it, and you push it out to the audience. It generally has a very long production cycle, not atypical for a book, right? 1.5 to 2 years in a waterfall development is not unusual. And it presumes that when you start, you know exactly what you want to come out at the other end, that there's not going to be lots of changes in the middle. And this is exactly what we do with books, right? We take a manuscript in, we acquire it, we work on it, we develop it with the editorial process. Then we package it in production and marketing, and then we talk about it in sales, and we push it out to the audience. It's a pretty linear process for us, and waterfall development software is a pretty linear process. One of the problems in software development, though, is that often we're creating new products for an audience that we think we've identified, but we don't necessarily know for sure is out there. Or we don't necessarily know for sure what that audience wants. Again, there's an analog in publishing, right? We acquire a book, we pay a royalty, or in advance, and we acquire a book and we develop it, and we assume as publishers that we know what our audience is going to be for this book, right? And we do a little research. We look for comparable titles. We know that vampire books are really big right now, and so we know there must be an audience, so we can make another vampire book, and presumably that audience will like it. But it's basically a crapshoot, right? It's a very big gamble. Publishing has typically been a very big gamble. And that's been a real problem recently because as the market and consumer behavior and predictable channels of distribution are starting to break down, there's way more unpredictability than there used to be in the whole model. So, and what that means is, as publishers, is that we don't necessarily have the ability to take such large risks, or at least we'd want to control our risks however we can, because we just don't know where this model is going, right? So we don't have as direct a route to our consumer. We just, lots of things are really changing for us as publishers. So anyway, in thinking about the changes in the model and sort of putting next to it my own process right now in launching this new company and really understanding Agile methodologies, I saw, oh, well, here's a real opportunity. Agile methodologies assume from the beginning that you don't necessarily know who your audience is. You don't necessarily know what your demand is. You don't even necessarily know what product you're building in its entirety. You have an idea, and you presume, like inherent to the process, is the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty and that you probably will be making changes in reaction to either the development process or your process of discovery of the market for whom you're developing, or even, once you get in and start to talk to your potential consumer of your product, you discover that they might want something, or there might be a feature that would be better for them. So Agile technologies and methodologies for development started because, they allow you to start from point A and then do some development and then check back in with your audience and then get feedback, and then in sort of internalize that feedback, make a new plan, develop your next version, check in with your audience, see what they think, make some decisions based on that. And you just continue this process. And the content production schedule in Agile is like weeks as opposed to months or years. You might have a 1 month, I'm a big fan of Scrum, which is a very particular methodology within Agile, where, and I'll talk a little bit about what the workflow in terms of applying it to teams is in a minute. But basically, Scrum says that you have these sprints, and you start at the beginning, you have a meeting, you define all of the things you think you can get through in a sprint period, which would be usually anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. You line those up on your to-do list, and then every day you decide what you're going to tackle, and you develop, and then you touch base with your team, and you take the next group and you develop, and every day there's a cycle until you reach the end of the period. And then hopefully at the end of the period you have something that's complete, that is actionable so that you can actually use it, and then you push it out and you test it, and then you come back for the next sprint based on the feedback of that period, and you continue to develop like that. So this started me thinking in publishing, like, okay, well, what would happen if we applied Agile methodologies to the publishing world? And I think, as I said earlier, we're really talking about two different applications. I think we're talking about the workflow application of Agile technologies, and we're talking about the content production application of Agile methodologies. And I think they're very different. And so I can talk about either one of those depending on what you want to do. Do you think that covers it, though?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great summary, because there were a couple things that went through my mind as you were talking, and one of which was I was thinking back to a former employer of mine, and the head of the organization was once asked, "How do you guys in publishing do market research and figure out what the audience needs?" And his answer was, "We publish books," and then based on that demand, that tells us if we need to do the next one or not, which is so simplistic in other industries, but that truly is how it works so often. But the other thing that comes to mind is something like Kickstarter, which I would think could be a valuable tool. And I've seen, I guess there's another startup called PubSlush that just announced recently that they're kind of the Kickstarter for book publishing, where you can sort of take a pulse of the interest level for a book product and decide whether it's worth investing in or not. Do you see that dovetailing at all with how you're describing Agile?
Yeah, well, so let's talk about. I think it's really important. I think in publishing, we're sort of we've been on a trailing edge in many ways because of our model. I think that we typically, because of the way we've approached book publishing, and the fact that we get the product from the author and then we put it through the production process, we don't necessarily think about sort of what the front end of that would be, which would be talking to the audience. And I think that we've depended on sales of other books, sales of other genres to sort of lead the way for subsequent products, right? Which is a bit of a reaction, right? We know that vampire books are popular right now. So ergo, after the first vampire book breaks, we see 12 or 16 or 18 or 24 other vampire books coming down the pike in the next 2 years, which, by the time the last ones trail through the cycle, there's a lot of fatigue. The consumer's onto something else. I think that, but the thing I want to mention is that I think in publishing, sort of, we're throwing around a lot of terms right now, right? Crowdsourcing, we're sort of sensitive to these things out in the, in the ionosphere, right? So crowdsourcing is something that we're starting to talk about. Discovery is something that we're talking a lot about. We have been for the last couple of years. I think that we have to be careful to distinguish the idea of audience intelligence. Understanding the audience is one thing. Crowdsourcing content is another thing. And I just mention that because there have been some projects that have emerged the last couple of years, which are crowdsourced content projects, content experiments, where, it's more of a forum-based group development thing where you write something or a group edits it. It's kind of the Wikipedia model of building a book or a story or whatever. I personally, as a publishing professional, don't necessarily think that that's going to create products that really are going to meet the demand of the marketplace for really fresh and interesting new points of view. I think that when you crowdsource content, you typically get, it's sort of the irony of crowdsourcing is that if you let it run on long enough, everything will have 3 stars, right? Because it's a sheer numbers game, right? If you let enough people review a movie or a product, it probably is going to wind up with 3 stars in the middle because that's just the nature of bell curves. So when I talk about applying Agile methodologies, I'm not necessarily talking about crowdsourcing content or, really opening up your content creation process to lots of hands, right? What I'm really talking about is what you can do, but what it would mean to publishing if you had a tighter feedback cycle and a tighter intelligence cycle with your audience. And so, let's just talk about publishing content development for a minute, right? I think that you have an author who has a really interesting point of view. I think you'll never replace a really great, innovative, groundbreaking author in this model, because I think that it's sort of the auteur thing, right? It's one point of view. It's really interesting. It's really fresh. Brian Selznick would not be Brian Selznick with too many fingers on the button ahead of time. I think that's true of many breakout authors. But what happens is that but I think you can really benefit in many ways in publishing from having a much tighter relationship with the audience that you're trying to develop for. So for instance, market research, which you mentioned earlier, is like an obvious thing. Right now we depend on point of sales data, which is a following piece of data, right? We know that it's sold, so we're going to develop to it because it already sold. That's following data. Leading data would be trend research. It would be audience communication. It would be surveys. It would be data mashups that really look at aggregating larger trends in society and really looking outside for some directions that you might want to acquire content to meet, right? Sort of a smarter, outward-facing model instead of what I typically think of in publishing as the Citadel model. We've sort of been in our ivory tower and we know our business and we're really good at it and we're really passionate about it, but we haven't been so good about opening ourselves up to communication with the larger audience. Partly because I think we're afraid of being overrun by the number of people who would like to publish and the number of people who think they'd like to publish. So I think we need to solve that problem, right? We need tools. We need to really think differently about trends, trend analysis, audience analysis. And then I also think, like, within publishing, I think that, you know, it takes us sometimes 2 years to put a book to market. And we make lots of decisions about jacket, about copy, about packaging, about format, about channel. Many of those choices are actually made in the P&L analysis of the project before we even acquire it in publishing. So we're making certain assumptions about the project before we even take it on, right? A P&L for a book. You know what the price point's going to be when you acquire it. You know, you have some idea of how you think you're going to push it out to the audience, what format, how much it's going to cost to print it. All those things really dictate a lot about a book's kind of travel down the publishing pipeline. And it locks us in to a very particular way of doing business. And I think that that's something we have to revisit. And then, I think we can revisit that in lots of ways. I think that there's the ability to serialize content and push it out, which is something that I know that O'Reilly's doing in a really interesting way. We could create value propositions. You know, we don't just have to deal with the book. We can create value propositions in that curve that capitalize on the audience's interest in lots of different ways. We can we can serialize chapters. This works great for nonfiction, by the way. It works great for any kind of content that is really timely. Like you want to get something out right now about something that's happening right now. Okay, well, let's just serially push it out, right? Let's push out a chapter at a time, and let people subscribe to that. And that I've seen some very interesting pricing models where you know, that if you subscribe to it, I think, is this your pricing model actually? Tools, did we talk about this at one point? That if you buy the first chapter and you commit to the whole feed, it's cheaper, and that as the feed goes along, as it gets closer to completion, the price goes up.
That's right.
That you aggregate, you get your most committed users up front, and you incentivize them by you know, getting them to buy in early, and then that they get a better deal. But then also you have a relationship with them. You can talk to them through the cycle, get feedback from them, and then you can also they will evangelize for you. They will spread the word. So it's like a virtuous circle in many different ways. Like, that's very interesting to me. Whether or not that would work with fiction, I think it might actually work with fiction. I mean, Dickens was serialized. I mean, we have plenty of evidence. Twain was serialized. We have plenty of precedent for that in fiction as well. But that, I think a lot of times when I talk to publishers about this, about changing this production model a little bit, or experimenting with it, they kind of freak out because they feel like the quality, the uniqueness of the book, of the author's voice might be corrupted by too much input from the crowd. You know, and there's certainly authors who need to just go to an island, write the book, and come back and deliver it to us without too much interference. But I think in certain content areas like nonfiction, like contemporary events, like fiction that really has a huge fan base that's genre driven, so serial fiction, there's no reason why if you have a series. I mean, I think of Nancy Drew, which was my gateway drug to reading back when I was in elementary school. There's no reason why that kind of content can't have a really direct relationship with the audience that's going to be consuming it, I think.
Yeah, and just to go back on a couple of things here, when you talked about that serial approach with tools of change, we are experimenting with that right now. The first product we put out is from Todd Satterston. It's called Every Book is a Startup, and it really is all about this Agile model that you're talking about, where we came up with, I should say the author, Todd, came up with the minimum viable product, just a couple short chapters. We're getting that out to the audience to get their feedback, and that's going to help shape the rest of the product down the road. But I want to go back to something you said a minute ago, which I think really sort of captures the heart of this, and that is, as an industry, we are so caught up in lagging indicators, right? So how did compara books comparable books sell? What did the book scan look like for this particular title? Should we do another one like it as a result of that? And I feel like what you're talking about with Agile is getting past that, getting out in front of the curve, and having that relationship with even a part of the audience to begin with, so that we can have some leading indicators through that cycle with the audience and getting feedback on the concept and the minimum viable product and everything else with it. Does that kind of sum it up pretty well?
Totally. I mean, I would argue. I mean, I would advocate for just really looking for ways to transform our. I mean, I think by the time the book is sold and you have POS information, it's too late. I mean, you're already way behind.
Yeah.
And it sort of boggles the mind. This is sort of a typical example from my days in corporate publishing. I can't tell you how many jacket meetings I sat through with multiple people around a table arguing over a jacket, which, first of all, I think the committee process on that kind of thing always winds up, or generally winds up, in a pretty poor product, because you just can't get consensus, and you wind up with, again, the mediocre middle ground. But then you push the book out to the bookstore, and I could tell you as a bookseller on the other side of this, the book comes in and you think, crap, like, why didn't they ask me about this? This is a terrible package for this book, or they completely missed the mark, or this is a completely inappropriate jacket for my audience, or whatever it is. It is only lately that we've developed, one of my side gigs is I work with Bowker PubTrack, which is Bowker, for those of you guys who don't know, is the data. They sort of hold the data pipeline that underpins the entire book industry. And back in 2009 or January 2010, I guess, they launched PubTrack, which is a direct-to-consumer intelligence project where they are doing really interesting deep dive surveys with book consumers. It might seem really obvious, but this is the first time that we are actually saying, hey, consumers, tell us a little bit about what's driving your choice. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you like. And so, to go back to this jacket thing, why are we not A/B tested jackets until this point? Like, we can do that now. Why is not every single book jacket or book image that's being pushed out being A, B, C, D tested with a consumer market? Because there's no reason for us to sit around and argue in a publishing committee meeting when we could just ask the consumer, get a way better answer, an answer that probably, maybe 1 out of 4 times aligns with it, but 3 out of 4 times would surprise us, and put out a much better product that's going to sell right from the shelf. Because we know that our selling time in a bookstore or online is about like somewhere between 1 and 3 seconds in terms of an impression that would make people turn over the book and read the flap. That just is like an obvious no-brainer that we are still at this moment not taking advantage of. So there's that kind of thing. And then I also think that as internally in publishing, we need to hire some consumer psychologists immediately. We need to actually put brand intelligence, brand analysis, trend analysis right in the front of our publishing process. And I'm not advocating for the other sort of sacred cow in publishing that we hear about a lot is, oh my God, we can't let marketing or sales meddle too much in our editorial process, or even worse, this book was acquired or not acquired based on the sales team or based on the marketing team. I'm advocating for something different, which is that there's no reason at the top of the publishing chain, when you are looking to acquire content, that you can't have someone up there who's really tied into brand awareness, tied into trend analysis, cool hunting, all those kinds of things, not necessarily to dictate what we acquire, because I think the editorial and curatorial process of publishing is very important. I don't agree with people who think that publishing, the act of publishing and the act of editing is going to go away. I think it's incredibly important. And I think having a really singular point of view is one of the most important parts of sort of penetrating through this really loud marketplace. But that being said, we need at this point to have a more direct awareness of the marketplace, and not necessarily in POS data or in even talking to readers. I'm suggesting looking for new and interesting indicators out there in the environment that don't have anything to do with books. And part of that for me is really, one of the sort of central planks in our platform as a new company is just that I believe that the future of search, the future of reading, the future of consuming content isn't necessarily about silos of content. I don't think that books, readers are only going to be reading books. I think, they're interested in books as idea containers, which is what we do so well. But I think if I'm really interested in horses, or you could take my daughter, for instance, right? She's really into fairies right now. She's 4, right? So fairies is the thing for her. It's not books about fairies. It's fairies. So for her, her content consumption is books about fairies, games about fairies, fairy music, fairy movies, fairy costumes. For her, it's about the world of fairies. And I think that, we're now seeing technologies that are powerful enough to potentially deliver that kind of search and consumption. And it's a much, more intuitive, more frictionless way of sort of, it's the way the human brain works, right? So as publishers, as the purveyors of, containers of ideas at the core of what we do, we have to throw a much wider net out there for understanding our environment,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I keep thinking of that whole, again, focus on lagging indicators versus leading indicators, and I think everything you're describing should really encourage us to do more of the latter and less of the former. So let's talk for a minute, though, about implementing Agile. And, one of the things I wonder about is so many people that are part of the TOC audience are from larger houses and, for one reason or another, maybe set in their ways and have a really great model that they're very attached to. So how could they get into experimenting with Agile? Could they pull a small team aside and have them just adopt it? Or do they need to go wholesale across the entire organization and buy into it?
Well, I'll tell you, I think it would be very challenging to try. We know, not from publishing, but just from large companies in general, that it's very, very hard for a large company to behave like a startup. And what we're really advocating for is teams to behave like startups, right? Really having the freedom to shift paradigms, to really create new workflows, create whole new systems. So that being said, I think this is sort of shifting now into the discussion of Agile as a workflow. And one of the things that I think is really powerful about Agile as a workflow is that, it demands a flattening of hierarchy within a team. Typically, what you have is I'm going to go now dip back into software development terms, but just as a way of explaining kind of what we're talking about. In Scrum methodology, which is what we're moving towards using, you have a couple of different key roles in this process. You have the product owner, who's the person who understands the audience, who really understands the product that you're trying to create, and who ultimately has the power to dictate the direction of the development and to make sure that the development is going to meet the audience need. Underneath that product owner, you have someone who's called the Scrum Master. And this is just a fancy pants word for the person who is going to facilitate the development process. Now, they're not a manager of the development process. It is not their job to run, oversee, and run the team. They're not on top of the team. They're actually a facilitator. And then sort of working with them are the development team. And this team typically in Scrum is a flat team. There are people, generally you want people from different competencies there. You want coders there. You want designers there. You want user interface people there. You probably want what are called UX designers, which are user experience designers who really understand the psychology of what you're trying to do. But it's a diverse team, and they're on a flat level. They're working together. They each take responsibility for certain things that need to be executed. But they are not. There is no vertical hierarchy in this. It's basically all on the same level. And they're not reporting to the Scrum Master. What happens in this process is that the Scrum Master's job to make sure that there are no barriers to innovation that are stopping the development from moving forward. So in that iterative process, what happens is that team says, okay, in the next 2 weeks, we think we can develop this chunk of what we're trying to do. And at the end of 2 weeks, it's going to be complete. So we're going to develop these pages or this function or this data algorithm or whatever it is. It's a manageable chunk. It's complete. And then every day, that team says, today I'm going to work on this piece of that 2-week build. And the Scrum Master's job in the morning is to have a team meeting where they talk to that person, and then the Scrum Master says, okay, well, what's the problem? You didn't get through what you were supposed to get through yesterday. What's the problem? What's holding you up? Well, I don't have this key piece of information, or my computer crashed, or I didn't get a piece of data, or whatever. I didn't get something from somebody else. The Scrum Master's job is to clear that impediment. So they figure out how to sort of make that happen for the team. So they're kind of they're an empowerment agent for the team. So what this allows is that everyone who's working on this project has direct input, has the ability to say for themselves what they can accomplish within a day or a week or 2 weeks. No one is on the top of them. They have control over their working environment. They have pretty much control over everything. Their only responsibility to make that system work is to be really honest about what they can get through. If you only have 4 hours to work and you know that you can only do one thing that day, then that's what you do. You don't worry about the long, huge to-do list or the massive, workload that's in front of you. That's the Scrum Master's job, to manage that. Your job is just to say what you can do today, to sit down and do it to the best of your ability. That is a radical shift from the way most publishing houses are set up right now, which are vertical hierarchies with many layers of management and with very, very distinct layers of hierarchy where you have to sort of, if you are an intern in the marketing department, you are not talking generally to the people more than one step above you in this process. And you certainly are not having control over your work environment. You are not necessarily having direct input into what you're working on. Your job is to execute whatever you do as the marketing person, right? The marketing intern or the lower level marketing person. And I think that, I can just tell you my disposition doesn't react very well to that environment. There's a reason why I'm not in corporate publishing anymore. That's not my style at all. And I think that this is a direct result of the fact that publishing is working on a manufacturing model for the most part. It's designed as a vertical model where the product comes in the top and it goes through the factory and it comes out the other end as a complete, shippable, highly polished object.
Right.
Now, this is directly in conflict with the environment that we've just addressed. The fact that we're following with our data, we're following with our product, we're not leading, we don't have fast enough production cycle, and that hierarchies are just really bad for encouraging quick iteration. Because you have to have permission from the person above you to execute, and that person has to have permission, and that person has to have permission. And that I think is one of the biggest impediments that we face. So, the question of whether or not you could conceivably develop a team within a larger corporation or a larger corporate structure that could do this, I think so. If you had a really, really innovative and visionary leader. I mean, I think that this kind of transformation cannot come from the bottom up. It has to come from the top down. And it would require publishing, people at the very top of the publishing model right now to want to do it. And so is that possible? I don't know. Okay. I think it's a huge opportunity for small presses, though, because I think small presses can absolutely transform themselves this way. Any press that has less than 100 people working for it can transform itself in this way, I think. And I think there are companies like O'Reilly who have set out to sort of use alternative methodologies and are really rooted in this kind of culture. And if you build a company that way, then I think it's totally possible to scale up to a much larger size.
So let me ask you something related to that, because the other impediment I would see that maybe some publishers and editors would look at is, again, contrasting the software development world to the book publishing world. So on the software side, we're used to alpha releases and beta releases, and basically something that's not ready for prime time, and you know that there's going to be warts with it and so forth. But now if you start thinking, okay, let's apply this minimum viable approach to book publishing, where I think the mindset historically has been, we're not going to put this out there until it's completely polished and finished and perfect. But you got to get away from that. So, I mean, can we really kind of break through that and kind of bring both of those models together so that we can go with more of an agile approach and be comfortable with something that's less than finished and less than perfect?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about beta audiences or alpha audiences for a minute, okay? Because I think that this is something really germane to this. when you push out a minimum viable product in an agile process, you are not pushing it out to the larger consumer market. You're generally pushing it out to a closed test group, and so it is clearly not perfect. I mean, you call it an alpha or you call it a beta. You tell them that there are going to be glitches. You tell them there are going to be bugs. You're going to, in writing or in publishing, you'd say there's going to be typos in this, or this is not finished. But I think the way that you would do this, and actually I saw a great example of this back in July. John Green, one of my very, very favorite YA authors, pushed his not yet edited book. I don't even think it's edited yet. We'd have to check that. But he certainly pushed his book that is not yet published to the top of the Amazon bestseller list on pre-orders because he, from the comfort of his armchair, told his followers that he had something new coming, and they got really excited, and they started designing crowdsourced jackets for it, and his whole social media following just exploded with enthusiasm over this. This is his beta audience. These are the guys who would be happy to look at something early and give him feedback, and that there's no reason why that can't be in the sort of today's social world, that you can't, as an author or a publisher, push something out. I mean, it's the equivalent of a sample chapter, but even rougher than that. And I don't think this is going to work for every author, okay? Because I think it requires a very particular relationship with your audience, and I think it requires a little bit of a thick skin, because you have to then take all of that feedback and filter it and decide what of it is going to be useful to you and what is not going to be useful to you. And if you don't have a really solid fence post, sort of idea of what you're trying to do, it would be easy to kind of lose your point of view. But I think that it's entirely possible to basically take a beta test approach to content and push out early versions for feedback beyond what's typically a kind of a readers group. Most authors put their book out to a readers group, which probably includes fellow writers. It certainly includes their editor. It might include their agent. We're talking about something larger, which is that developing an alpha or beta group around an author, really, really committed, excited readers who are going to be perfectly happy to see an unedited or an uncopywritten draft of anything and would be happy to provide feedback. And that you can make that group as small or as large as you want. And the other advantage, just from a leading marketing point of view, is that these guys are going to evangelize. If you open up that project to a consumer marketplace and you give a larger access to a group of extremely passionate readers, they're going to put up with an imperfect product. They're going to give you valuable intelligence, and they are going to spread the word like crazy and help you get grassroots marketing for your book before it's even ready for market. That's incredibly valuable. I mean, you can't pay for that at the bookstore level, and it's absolutely authentic. It's absolutely passionate. It is peer to peer. And then you could also incentivize that group to spread the word further on, right? So if they've read an early draft, they're the first people who are going to get a finished draft, and that you could say to them, you can actually incentivize them in some way to help you spread the word. I mean, in a really concrete way, hey, Des Moines, passionate readers in Des Moines, if you, we know that you read an early draft. Now we're really excited. This novel is finished. We're going to push it out. If you guys can get X number of pre-sales in your, if we can get a group of 200 pre-sales or 1,000 or 5,000 pre-sales in your community, we're going to send the author. Let's have a party. Right. Let's send the author. You guys can meet him, and we can thank you for all of the awesome help you've given us in this. That would be huge. And it, in terms of cost per reader, so much less expensive than co-op, so much less expensive than an ad in the paper, and highly local, highly social. Like that would be radical, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is, obviously you guys are using this methodology within Bookigee, and we're going to see it live here before too long in that first product this fall. But can you give us any examples of products or publishing houses out there that have shown how Agile not only works, but that it's a better model than maybe what they could have chosen elsewhere?
I thought about this before we started this, because I knew that this question was going to come up, and And I have to say, I'm kind of hard pressed, actually, to find a house that I think is, besides O'Reilly, I think, who is really, really on a corporate level or on a sort of just on a really core level, shaking it up in this way. I think that there are authors who have done a fantastic job of really communicating with their audience and have built a platform for themselves that would allow them to do this. I mentioned John Green at the YA market, who I think is phenomenal. We've seen obvious examples like James Patterson on the adult side, or Paul Coelho, or Stephen King was an early leader in this idea of building an audience that you can directly in fact, I think Stephen King is probably one of the best examples of being about 20 years in front of everyone else when it comes to this. Pushing out chapters, pushing out audience-only product that only goes out to his core audience and keeps them really excited, that kind of thing. I would love to be able to say that I thought that there were a dozen publishers right now that I thought were really pursuing this, but I'm hard pressed to think of anyone who's really doing it in a way that I think is sort of blazing a trail. I think there are certain publishers who are really, really good at understanding their audience and who I think are doing some very interesting experiments. Scholastic is one that comes to mind in terms of thinking about really smart transmedia experiments with their audience. Because Scholastic has a bunch of different channels, they've always been diversified, right? They've got book fairs, they've got book clubs, they've got trade, they've got education. Their team has been very smart in thinking about their audience, and I have to say we've generally given those guys a rap on the knuckles as an industry for that, because we think it's commercial, we think it cheapens the product. I think that this is something that we really have to think about, and I am not like I said earlier, I'm not advocating for wholesale kind of mass market. I'm not advocating for moving everything to a mass market approach. I think actually what we're talking about is a boutique approach, really understanding a boutique audience in this particular area. So it's not about mass. It's not about Costco. It's about understanding that whatever that author's group is and collecting that audience around them and publishing directly to them, not to a mass audience, but to a very specific, small, highly targeted, highly passionate audience. And I'll tell you, I think that another group that really does it well within publishing, and also, it would be the book packagers, people like Alloy Media. They are definitely going for a mass channel with what they produce, but I'll tell you, they know their audience. They know it really well, and they have a bunch of different trend tracking technologies and a lot of diversification in how they approach the market. So they're not just producing books, they're producing lots of different kinds of content. They've got a great web program that supports their books. Obviously, they're going out into film and other kinds of content with what they're putting together. But those guys are super smart. They definitely know their audience and really understand how to speak to that audience and have a direct channel to their readers. So I think we need to look at them. And I think the question becomes, as an industry, how do we adopt these technologies in a way that does preserve voice, that does preserve point of view, that creates not a less interesting product, but a more interesting product, a smarter product, a product that has, that allows us to actually stabilize a lot of the sort of insecurity in this model right now, the sort of the gambling effect. Like, we need to stop gambling. I think we need to really, really, I think that if we adopt these kinds of methodologies, we're actually going to have less risk. We're going to have less expense because we're pushing out just what we need to push out. We're going to, create a better product at a more sustainable price point and at a more sustainable from a workflow point of view. So I just think that it's, when we look at the vertical publishing model with all these layers, right, somewhere between 15 and 18 layers sit right now between the author and the reader. When we flatten those layers through these technologies, through these approaches, you have this, it's a triangle, but really it's a circle. You have this feedback loop that connects the author, the publisher, and the reader that's the cycle. And we just have to do that because we cannot continue to do it the way we're doing it. It's crazy. It's crazy the way we do it right now.
Yeah, and I think, again, this can really help us break away from using lagging indicators and focusing more on leading indicators and being out in front and experimenting with that audience. So, and I think you're right. There probably aren't a whole lot of players out there that are leveraging it today, but it'll be interesting, the trailblazers like you and what we're doing at O'Reilly and some of the others you mentioned, to see how many may follow suit and if this thing will catch fire or not. So, anyhow, Kristen McLean of Bookigee, I really appreciate you taking the time for this podcast today, and it's been terrific talking to you and great information.
Totally my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about. I think it's really exciting. I think the one thing I would sort of close with is that I find myself explaining a lot to publishers right now the fact that I don't think the written word, the culture of the written word, the reading public, I don't think that's our problem. I think we're in a really exciting time if you're a content developer, if you're making books or you're writing. The culture of the written word is alive and well and growing. I think it's the business of the written word that needs to be transformed. That's what we're after, and I think you guys are after that, and I think that anybody who's really thinking about the future of the model needs to be thinking about that.
Amen. Great way to summarize it, Kristen. Again, thanks so much. Really appreciate you being part of this.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.